like to be driving that baby? Some thrill. But you know, before that pilot could fly from coast to coast in 3 hours plus, somebody had to invest about 1 million hours getting him ready for it. There's a lot of designing, testing, and trial runs behind every new innovation or new performance record. How do I know? My name's Carroll Shelby, and performance is my business. Well, I was in the chicken business. The story's been told 1,000 times. And all the chickens died with the limberneck, or Newcastle's disease, as it's called. So I'd always wanted to be a racing driver. I was 29 years old, and I said, to hell with it, I'm going out and do that. And a friend of mine had an MG, Ed Wilkins, in Dallas, MGTC, and we had been trying to build us a Chrysler Special with a Hemi engine. And to make a long story short, we went up to Oklahoma to a race in his MG, and I won the race. And from there on, it was about a 3-year struggle before I was driving for the Aston Martin team in Europe. The reason I wanted to go to Europe was because I wanted to learn how Ferrari, Maserati, Aston Martin, all those teams built their cars, and ran little automobile companies, and that was a double reason for me not only to drive race cars, but I wanted to learn how those little companies work. And I found that out, and when I quit in 1960, I started building the Cobra. Everybody's heard that story, I guess. I borrowed an engine from Ford. I got AC to build a chassis to take the V8 engine. Everybody thought that we just took an AC chassis, but it was much more complicated than that. We had to change the chassis. Although the chassis was the same type of design as the Chigero chassis from many years before that, it was a lot heftier and beefier to take the 400 horsepower that we were putting in it versus the 120 for the little AC Bristol engine. After Ford decided to jump in bed with me, they put some good people out helping me. Sometimes they were help and sometimes they were hindrance, because I knew what I wanted to build. I knew that you couldn't compromise it. And I was shooting for a little niche market. Now niches are all over the place. There's a lot of niche markets, but I didn't want to build but about 500 cars a year to begin with.
The first racing encounters of the early Cobras were a mixed bag of successes and failures. Every race smoked out another part or subsystem that needed improvement or upgrading. By 1963, with many of the mechanical shortfalls corrected, Carroll Shelby's spectacular juggernaut of racing championships got up to speed. That year, the Cobras won both the SCCA 8 Production National Championship and the newly organized United States Road Racing Championship. The Cobra would also become a national drag racing champion in the National Hot Rod Association. And while these were admirable jewels in the Shelby American crown, 1963 was not a rewarding year for the Cobras at international events such as Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans. It was in the following year that Shelby Team Cobras would begin to dismantle their overseas competition.
We wanted to go international racing, and the 0289 Cobra was about as aerodynamic as a shoebox. So we got together, Pete Brock, Phil Remington, Al Dowd, several of the fellows around the shop, and Pete Brock came up with a sketch. I'd say the team was Pete, Phil Remington, and Ken Miles. And we came up with a car that went from 150 miles an hour with 400 horsepower to 200 miles an hour.
It debuted at the Daytona International Speedway on February 16, 1964, hence the name Daytona Coupe. Its first GT win occurred at the 1964 race at Sebring, and there were several other GT victories for the sleek Cobra that season. In fact, 1964 might have been the year that Carroll Shelby's aluminum-bodied snakes won the World Manufacturers' Championship. With 3 events remaining, the Cobras needed to show well in at least 2 to capture the necessary points for the championship. But one of those events was in Italy, where Enzo Ferrari wielded enormous clout.
We should have won the World Championship in 1964 with it, but old man Ferrari, being a rascal that he was, got the last World Championship event at Monza canceled. So we had beat him 5 straight races up till then, and he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he got it changed. But we nailed him next year, so it doesn't make any difference. The Cobra was nothing but a hot rod. The Scarabs were nothing but a hot rod. The big Ferraris were a hot rod. Big engines, light chassis, big brakes. I think that what went on in America in the late 50s, bringing out these hot rods and showing that they could compete with the best that the Europeans built, showed American ingenuity, and it helped a lot of us Americans get to Europe and get jobs over there because we had these hot rods to go win the races with and beat those Ferraris and so forth.
In 1965, perhaps the most notorious car to wear the Shelby name entered the fiercely fought muscle car rebellion and with startling immediacy took over sole control of the mean streets, the 427 Cobra.
First we put a 427 in a 289 chassis, and Ken Miles tested it. We called it the Mule and worse names because we knew that Chevrolet had said they weren't in racing, but they were secretly building the Grand Sport. And we would have had the 427 and a 289 chassis ready for them, but Ken wrecked it, and they'd never gone to to Nassau and beat the Cobras if Ken hadn't wrecked the car when we were testing it. However, that's where the 427 came from, and Klaus Arning, one of the Ford engineers, it was the first car that was laid out, chassis was laid out on computer. He's the one that did it. Phil Remington went over and to AC Cars and a couple of the other guys, and we put the car together all in 3 months, and we're producing it. And we had to do it to, in case Chevrolet had gone ahead and produced their lightweight Corvettes, which they went out of the business when they saw us building the 427 Cobras. So I was sorry to see that, because it would have been a lot of fun to race, to race them.
While the 427 Cobra was solidifying Carroll Shelby's place in muscle car history, another Shelby creation was emerging from the same Southern California gene pool from which the Cobra had hatched, taking a horse and giving it the fangs of a reptile.
Shelby Mustang came along because Coco went to Sport Car Club of America and says, we're going to make the Mustang a sport car. And I didn't know about this till about a month later. They'd gone to John Bishop and told him that they were going to make it a sport car. And he says, well, it's not a sport car, it's a 4-seat car, it's not a sport car. Finally, when they told Coco they couldn't make it a sport car, he called me and said, can you make a sport car? So I called my guys together, the people that I worked with at Ford and the people that, the Al Dowds and the Phil Remingtons, and said, can we make this a sport car? And then I called, we decided we could, and then I called John Bishop and said, John, what does it take to make the Mustang a sport car instead of saying, we're going to make this a sport car? And he says, oh, hell, Shelby, says that's pretty simple. Said, take the back seat out. And changed the suspension around so that it handles better and it's not a little old mushy six-cylinder. They'd start putting the V8s in them then. And so I got them to build a high-performance 289 V8. We took the suspension and changed it. We put a large rear end in it with a limited slip, took the rear seat out, and went out and beat the hell out of the Corvettes with it.
This GT350 is a racing version of Ford's Mustang 2+2. We set the cars up for racing by installing special components, racing shocks and so on. We're doing a lot of testing as well. This is Willow Springs Raceway, tucked away in the Mojave Desert. It's where we do much of the testing for our new cars. The interesting thing about testing out high-performance automobiles is that you can only do it with top drivers who can take the cars right up to the maximum. We've got with us today Pete Brock, head instructor at our driving school. Pete's behind the wheel of the new Mustang GT350.
The Shelby GT350 began life in 1965 as a rough-and-tumble performance fastback with power, handling, and blue-chip pedigree. It immediately dusted its competition, including the Corvettes, in the SCCA's B production category on its way to the national championship in 1965, 66, and 67.
In the early days, everybody had to do three jobs. The marketing man had to be the salesman, sometimes the janitor, sometimes the chief engineer had to be the chief mechanic or had to wipe the cars off, clean them up. So it was really a very interesting time. We had a lot of spirit around the place over in Venice, California at that time, and I longed for those days because I had more fun then building cars than I ever have since then.
After the World Championship season of 1965, Carroll Shelby had become more directly involved in Ford's ultimate quest, winning the 24 Hours of Le Mans with its Ford GT.
Well, we did all right the first couple of times out. The field of cars were very impressive at Daytona and Sebring. Now we're getting ready for the big ones overseas, Monza, Targa Florio, and Le Mans. In the weeks to come, we hope to continue our string of victories. It's a cinch that whatever success we find, we'll also find our share of disappointments. Motor racing is that way. It's a rich mixture of heartache and joy. For those of us who participate in this most exciting of sports, the Ford people, our crews, drivers, whatever the outcome, racing becomes a never-ending pursuit of excellence.
Hal Sperlich and Ray Geddes and I went to Europe and hired John Wire, who used to run the Aston Martin team, and we took Eric Broadley in, but and bought the rights to a car that he had done, a low rear engine, midship engine GT car, but he couldn't stand the Ford politics, and being the independent cuss that Eric is, I can't say that I blamed him, because he knew what he wanted to do, and he didn't need 3,000 engineers telling him what he wanted to do, what he ought to do, and 15 marketing people telling him what he ought to do, and everybody having a different opinion of what you ought to do, and so he pulled out of it. But the GT40 evolved from that. John Wire put the people together over in England, and that's where the GT40 came from. Then we did a lot of work on it, but we didn't do any of the initial design work. That was John Wire and Lynn Bailey, and we did a lot of development work in it. We raced it, and when the GT40 really became viable, though, was when Bill Ennis and all those wonderful engineers, O'Sullivan that built the first Ford Flathead, built us a 427 aluminum engine and put it on the dynamometer and ran Le Mans with an engine and gearbox 3 or 4 times. If it broke, they fixed it, strengthened that part, and that's the reason we went and went to Le Mans and won in '66 and '67.
Ford would achieve their Le Mans victory in 1966. Ford GTs would finish first, second, and third, with the top two finishing cars, the ones prepared by the Shelby team. Several months later, the Shelby American team would suffer an immeasurable loss. One of the most valuable members of the Shelby American success story, who had come aboard in early 1963, was Ken Miles. He was an outstanding driver and development specialist. He had been instrumental in the Shelby racing program and in the development of the 427 Cobra and the GT350. In August of 1966, while testing the new Ford GT-J car at Riverside, he crashed and was killed.
Ken Miles, God rest his soul, the GT40s would never have reached the pinnacle that they reached without Ken Miles. He was the ultimate long-distance racer. He could go very quickly if he had to, but he was the ultimate as far as long-distance racing is concerned. I've never had a loss that hit me as hard as when we lost Ken. He was not only a friend, but he was a good engineer. He was a good test driver. He was as good a race driver as I ever knew. And I can't say what a void I felt when we lost him.
Shelby returned to Le Mans in 1967 to once again head up the Ford Assault. Remembering that race gives him a chance to talk about his close friend, Dan Gurney.
The greatest, I'm sure Dan wouldn't agree, or A.J. Foyt wouldn't agree, but the greatest drive that I've ever seen Dan put together was when he won Le Mans for us in a Ford GT in 1967. Foyt had just won Indianapolis. Foyt, you know, still had the fire in his belly. Gurney played it so cool and so smart. He never went within 15 seconds of how fast he could go in practice. And he did that for a reason. He knew Foyt would try to go faster. And he played it like that. He never, ever, even during the race, went anywhere near his limit. He drove such a beautiful race. All the rest of the Fords blew up. Gurney and Foyt held it together and won the race, which I think is as great a race as Foyt ever drove, too. And I've seen him drive a lot of them because he kept himself in check, although he wanted to go fast. Gurney kept himself in check. And while everybody else dropped by the wayside, they won the race. And to me, that just shows you what a bright individual that Dan Gurney is, and I will thank him for that to my dying day.
For Carroll Shelby, the dream had been realized. He had won a world championship, numerous national championships, and had taken Ford to the winner's circle at Le Mans twice. But the world and the cars he was building were changing.
I had a beautiful relationship with Ford in the earlier years. If we needed something, if we needed an engine built down the assembly line with a couple hundred at a time with another 100 horsepower, they did it for us. Wonderful people that we worked with in engineering. As it progressed and Ford got into serious racing themselves and spending a lot of money, there was a lot of jealousy due to the fact that we were an outside company. We were getting all these good pieces and parts, and created a lot of jealousy. And it wasn't as much pleasure as it was in the beginning. However, I have to say, in all honesty, I would never have been able to do what we did, or we would never have been able to do what we did if it hadn't been for Ford. Very fond memories for a lot of the people at Ford, the Homer Perrys and the people that were not only helpful, but were there anytime we needed them, and made it possible to go to engineering and get what we needed on very short notice, and helped us in every way they could. It ended about 1970 because performance went away. The Mustang was getting too heavy. You had to fool with environmental problems, emissions, and so forth that we had to clean the environment up, but there was nothing to do. There weren't any interesting cars you could build, so I went to Africa for 10 years. I wanted to see Africa before it was gone. And I'm glad that I went then because it'll be impossible to do in the 90s in Africa what I did in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, and that's see Africa as Africa was. God, those were great days. One week Chrysler had come out with another muscle car, and the next week Chevy had come out with another muscle car, and the next week Pontiac, and the next week Ford, and the next week Buick. We had some interesting cars back there then.
And Carroll Shelby's proud legacy of performance might have reached its ultimate conclusion 20 years ago, had it not been for a phone call in 1981 from an old friend.
When Icoca went to Chrysler, we started talking about putting some kind of little situation together, but they didn't have two pennies to rub together. So we finally got together last part of 81, and all we had was a little four-cylinder engine. We started playing with mirrors and trying to announce to the world that that was a performance car, and we built some pretty good cars. It's hard to talk somebody into that's responsible for the money to let you spend $100 million build another cylinder head and another $200 million to tool it up. But we're coming along with things like the Dodge Spirit with the little four-cylinder engine, 225 horsepower, a wonderful four-door sedan, as good a performing four-door sedan as there is in the world today. There are a lot of very interesting cars now coming out, but I'm afraid that that we're entering into another era of the bureaucrats in Washington forcing us to go back to four-cylinder engines, trying to raise the mileage up to something that's unconscionable. I'm afraid that we're entering that again. So just as we're beginning to have a little fun again, in spite of emissions, in spite of all the safety stuff that have been brought out, which I'm not degrading, we needed upbraiding a little bit in the industry, but we've accepted all that, and we're building interesting cars, and now they started yelling about, oh, now we got to double the mileage, and we've got to the cafe, the safety aspects. So I hope they don't run it again, but I don't have much hope that the bureaucrats aren't going to screw it up. You can't let the Naderites tell you what to build in an automobile when the public's the one that has to buy them. So if you listen to all these environmentalists and these bureaucrats, they would flat put us out of the automobile business because they don't give a hoot what the public wants to buy. They want to jam it up the public's behind what they're going to get.
Carroll Shelby underwent heart transplant surgery in late 1990, and the successful outcome restored much of the energy and enthusiasm that his ailing heart had robbed him of. Two projects, besides his Goodyear tire distributorship, now occupy the lion's share of his thoughts and efforts. One is the automobile that has been called the 427 Cobra reincarnate, the Viper.
I drove it the other day at the test track in Phoenix quite extensively. I can tell you for sure that it's a worthy successor to the Cobra, and it's a hell of an automobile. I'm tickled to death with it. The guys have done a terrific job of putting it together. It's going to be just about what the 427 Cobra was 30 years ago. It's still going to be a wind-in-the-face sport car, but it's got some improvements. Suspension, brakes, a few more of the creature comforts, but I am very, very happy to be associated with it, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot of test driving in it the next year while we're getting into production.
His second project is the Spec Racer, which he builds and distributes from his Southern California facility. A car that competes in its own Sports Car Club of America series, the Shelby Can-Am.
There aren't any American drivers in Formula One and in Europe anymore. And yet there's a whole bunch of American drivers that are capable of being in Formula One. And I built the Can-Am car so that we can have a cheap car that young Americans can get into after they race their little Formula Renaults for a season or so, and they can find out, and people can see whether they have any ability or not, so that they can move on up to Indianapolis and Formula One.
It's been over 25 years since the days when Carroll Shelby and his team tore holes in the air with the brute force of their handiwork. But his life and time still provide great enjoyment to the many members of the club that bears his name.
The Shelby Automobile Club, run by Rick Kopech and Ken Eber, is the greatest club that there is anywhere. And it's a wonderful automobile club for the simple reason that they own it and they don't get in squabbles all the time about who's going to be president next year, like all the other clubs do. They do a wonderful job of running it. They do a wonderful job of keeping this interest alive on these cars. And we were very fortunate that the cars came along right in the middle of the muscle car era, and then they went away in the 70s. And nobody's been able to build any cars like that again.
And as Carroll Shelby moves ever closer to a sixth decade of helping to define the boundaries of driving excitement, he is careful not to dwell too stubbornly on the accomplishments of yesterday.
I've had a lot of highs. Winning Le Mans as a driver, building the Cobra, winning the World Championship. Really, there's been so many of them that I can't decipher which was the most thrilling. The thing that's the most thrilling to me is the fact that I'm sitting here with a new heart, 34, 35 years old, and I'm still able to build what I want to build, and I want to cut back and have fun doing, instead of trying to build a lot of cars. I want to do what I've always wanted to do. That's build a few of them the way I want to build them for little niche markets, and be a part of the thing like the Viper, be a part of Chrysler's overall plans as far as product is concerned. I don't think that I'm past it in that. That's the highlight of my life. What's going to happen tomorrow?
In that golden age of horsepower, when broad-shouldered V8s that rippled with high-compression muscle tore at the pavement and filled the air with deep-throated voices warning of their intentions, there were indeed cars that rewrote the laws of physics with acceleration that could knock you senseless, and racetrack credentials that many cars with much longer lineages zealously envy. Carroll Shelby tipped the performance world upside down with his motley crew of West Coast hot rodders. They weren't interested in making history, yet they made it. They didn't care about creating legends, and yet their legends still shine brightly. They wanted to be the fastest, and having done that, they wanted to be champions. And in that brief, glittering snapshot of history, Carroll Shelby saw his dreams and the dreams of those around him come to pass in a land where giants once roamed.